Hello everybody, welcome back to Quest for Truth. The last couple of weeks we've been talking about salvation, and before that, even for a couple of weeks before that, we were looking through basically the chapter of Romans 3 and talking about from sin to salvation and how Christ has set into motion his plan to save humanity. And so today we're going to look, as I kind of said at the end of the video last week, we are going to look at how we accept that salvation, or what is the means to the salvation being applied to us. So we're going to start in where we left off last week, and then we're going to jump around to a couple of different passages in the New Testament. So we're going to start in Romans 3 in verse 27 to kind of get our footing, and then we'll go from there. It says this: "Where then is boasting? Is it excluded? By what kind of law? Of works? No, but by a law of faith." And so he's talking about salvation, and he says, how do we receive salvation? And he says, like, he kind of, as Paul does oftentimes, he brings in these kind of questions, and he says, where then is boasting? And he says, well, it's excluded. There is no boasting. Well, how is there no boasting? By what kind of law? How is the boasting excluded? If it's works, then, well, there can be boasting, right? But we know, most basically, right, that no, but by a law of faith. So it is in faith that we're saved, not through works. And there's no boasting because it's nothing that we have done, even really faith, as we'll look at, that has brought about our own salvation. And so, but what really is faith? I want to kind of look at that, see what faith actually is, before we kind of jump into a little bit deeper spot here. So we'll briefly look at Hebrews 11 verse 1. Now, a lot of you might know that Hebrews 11 is the chapter that's all about faith. It's the hall of faith, all these Old Testament saints that were saved by faith. So kind of logically, it starts off with what faith actually is. In chapter 11 verse 1, it says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." So faith is belief in what we can't see. Now, as we'll see, that doesn't mean that it's completely apart from what we can see, but that means that there's something that we can't see that we believe in. We believe even though we can't see it. And so but what really is this faith in, right? And I think there's a lot of people who would say, well, I believe in God, or I believe in Jesus, and that's enough for me. But what does the Bible have to say about faith? What do we actually believe in? And so we'll look at 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first few verses here that talk about, where Paul really lays out what the gospel is. And he says this: "Now I make known to you, brethren, the gospel which I preach to you, which also you receive, in which also you stand, by which you also are saved, if you hold fast the word which I preached to you, unless you believed in vain." And so really, right, he starts off by saying, believe in the gospel that we've taught to you, right? Okay, so then, what's the gospel? He continues, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. And he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and after he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to the apostles, and last of all, to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. And so, this, kind of looking at this, there's kind of two things, I think, that really stick out. The first is that as the with the names that he gives, right? So he says, he kind of starts off by saying he appeared to Peter, then to the 12, and then he appeared to 500 brethren, some of whom are still alive, and then he appeared to James and to Paul himself. And he kind of uses these two ideas here of, it's like he appeared to Peter, to the 12, to James, and to myself. He's saying, like, you could go talk to these, like, ask these people specifically. He's like, he's not saying, like, oh, these kind of random people. Like, no, like, he's saying, like, naming names, you know? And then he says, right, when he talks about the 500, he says there's a large swath of people like this that have observed Christ after he was resurrected. And he even says most of them are still alive, right? Most of them remain, though some have fallen asleep. Most of them are alive. So even those who aren't specifically named here, you can still go and actually talk to them. And so it gives credence. He's saying that, not even that it's giving credence necessarily because we can't go talk to them, but what he's really saying is it's an actual event that happened. You know, these aren't, a lot of people think that it's like metaphorical, like, because the blood, like with the whole, you know, blood thing, like that's barbaric or whatever. But he's saying, like, no, this is an actual event that happened. There were people who observed it that happened. And so it gives credence that it really did happen. And so we can believe in that it actually happened, right? In the gospel, that Christ died for our sins. He was buried and rose, then appeared to more than 500. Another thing that stuck out to me that I actually just noticed about this passage is, if you look at verses 2 and 3, there's 2 according to the scriptures. The first one comes after it says Christ died for our sins, and then it says that he was buried, and then it says that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures, and then he appeared to Cephas, to the 12, and etc., etc. It's interesting that that according to the scriptures, the first one comes right after his death. He died, and then it says he was buried. Well, people who are alive don't get buried. People who are dead do. So essentially, his burial is evidence of his death. He's saying he died. How do we know he died? Well, he was buried. He was put into a tomb. And then comes down again to say he was resurrected, right? He was raised on the 3rd day according to the scriptures. Well, how do we know that? It was evidenced by these appearances to all of the different saints here, you know, with Peter, the 12, the 500, and so on. And so that is Paul kind of set this up in that way of saying, like, well, he was dead. Well, how do we know he was dead? Because he was buried. That's evidence to the fact that he died. And how do we know that he was resurrected? Well, there's evidence. He was witnessed to be alive after he was dead. And so he builds this kind of argument based on evidence that Christ had died and was resurrected. So we really have good reason to believe in what we believe. Now that kind of brings us to another question of faith, because a lot of people will say that if you know something to be true, if you have evidence for something and you're like, oh, this is true, you know it to be true, well then they would say you can't have faith. If you have, this idea of like faith and reason don't go hand in hand, but they really do. Faith and reason go hand in hand, because what we see is evidence of what we can't see. We don't see everything. We don't necessarily at every moment know everything either. And we don't know when Christ will return, but we know that he will. But does that somehow eliminate our faith that it will happen? Certainly not. It strengthens it. And so that evidence, right, his first coming, his death and resurrection is evidence first to salvation, and then to the promise that he gave that he would return. And so we can believe that he'll return based on his first coming. That doesn't negate faith in that, but it actually makes it a deeper faith, because we have reason to believe, yet even without that reason we can still believe. But so, kind of, if we go back, think back a few weeks, when we were in Romans 3, verse 11, we said that no one seeks after God. And if no one seeks after God, there's an interesting idea here. We've talked about what faith is, and like us believing in who he is and what he has done, right? Well, how do we come to faith if no one seeks after God? That's like a basic question of like, well, if I never sought him, how did I believe in him? Well, if we go back to Hebrews, and right after, like I said, chapter 11 is the Hall of Faith, and you come after to chapter 12, and we're going to talk about a very brief part of it, but I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of faith, who, for the joy set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And so this is, this passage is being used as encouragement of, running the race kind of idea here, really, of that. But when you look at that first part of verse 2, when he says, how do we endure the race? By fixing our eyes on Jesus. And then he says kind of, who is Jesus? The author and perfecter of our faith. That word author means originator, means it comes from him. So Jesus is the originator of our faith. That means that our faith began in him. It didn't begin with us, it began with him. So not only is salvation from him, but actually faith itself comes from him, and it's given by Christ. So we talked about salvation as a gift a few weeks ago, I think, and it's the same with faith, really. Faith is also given to us. It is not something that is of ourselves, but it is given by Christ. And that's why when you go back to Romans 3 verse 27, we have nothing to boast in of ourselves, because even the fact that we believe is because of Christ. And so the faith that we have of Christ's death and resurrection itself began with him. It's through his grace that we have faith in him, and it's not of ourselves, so that we have nothing to boast in but Christ and him crucified. And that is the faith of his death and resurrection that comes from him, that brings us to salvation in him. See you next week.